Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and it's been so exciting talking with all the Denters this week. The energy here is just amazing. So as an artist, people often come up to me quite frequently and ask, where do you get your inspiration from? And you know, I really get it from things that happen to me in my life and conversations that I have with all sorts of people, very diverse from all walks of life, all backgrounds. And so today I want to share 5 such inspirational exchanges with you. And I call them 5 gifts that I found, because although they were like pieces of wisdom, pieces of advice, ideas that were gifted to me, I feel like I still had to quote unquote find them. That is to say, so as to not let them pass me by and to let them influence my life and my art. And I also want to share 5 artworks that some of them relate to those, and some of them even were immediately inspired by. And this is the Dent conference, where it's a wonderful statement that we can never repeat too many times that Steve Jobs told us, we're here to put a dent in the universe. And so I thought it would be only appropriate to start with a piece of advice that the godfather of Dent gave to me directly. So I was commissioned by Wynton Marsalis, as artistic director of jazz at Lincoln Center, to create many artworks. Wynton is he's a 9-time Grammy award-winning musician, the only musical artist to win Grammys in both classical and jazz category. And I had done an album cover for his Sony Columbia release. I had done portraits of him and musicians at Jazz at Lincoln Center. And I was often backstage studying the music, analyzing it, talking to the musicians. But you know who was also backstage in those days? Steve Jobs. He was also fascinated with jazz. And so I would see him on multiple occasions. And one day, Wynton said to me, hey, why don't you meet us? We're going to be at this venue nearby the concert. Come and talk to us. And so I went there, and I still remember as I was walking up, he and Wynton were having this totally heated exchange. And I could tell it was about art and technology. And I came up, and after a very glowing introduction from Wynton, Wynton ended with, and this is why you have to talk to Drue. So, it was a great exchange, and I left. And then 1 week later, out of the blue, Steve Jobs calls me and says, "Hi, it's Steve." And it was an amazing conversation, which I can't go all into now. But point blank, he says to me, "Do you take any drugs?" And I said, well, no. I don't. He said, well, you're an artist. You should take drugs. All artists should take drugs. And it was such a funny scene, guys. I'm a recent Stanford grad. I was a little bit taken aback by I'm talking to him on the forcefulness and the passion with which he's telling me this. And then on his end, I think he was a little disappointed and then also slightly puzzled, because why would an artist not take drugs? But then over the years, I realized that Steve Jobs has a point, as probably he does with everything that he comes out of his mouth, which is that art is like a drug. It's something that distorts our reality, transforms our brain state, takes us to another realm, transports us, takes us on various trips and journeys. And so I've been meditating on this piece of advice from Steve Jobs, and I think he was onto something. So I want to start with the most recent artwork that I've created, which is something entirely in virtual reality. And why? Because talking about drugs and art, VR is like the LSD of art. And it's also the future of art. Because virtual reality realizes this dream that we as artists have had for millennia, stretching all the way back 30,000 years ago to the cave artist at Lascaux, that we wanted to build whole immersive worlds. And now we can, atom by atom, pixel by pixel. And so really, we're just limited by our imaginations. Well, that and the fact that there's some technical glitches and VR is very buggy and there's a lot of different problems, but still, it's really amazing. And I think we're at the gates of a revolution. It's exciting how many people are in VR at this conference. And I think that, in the next 5-10 years, VR is going to make the advent of the internet seem minuscule. So here is this piece. These are some stills of this whole winter landscape that I created. These giant sequoia trees, this is the bark of the tree, this is all painted in tilt brush. But, and this is a video. But, oh my gosh, I gotta turn down the volume backstage. Here at Dent, we have like a full VR installation of this. So you can actually walk through it, which is the way that it should be experienced. The trees are at full scale, and you can walk underneath them. The snow will fall under your nose. There's a magical frozen lake, and there's a unicorn that's 4 times as big as you, a unicorn of fire. So I encourage you to experience it, and I thank Sonova for bringing their Vive to allow us to do this installation. So the next gift I found comes from JeanPierre Rampal. So when I was graduating from high school and college, I had my mentors like in 2 camps. I had the people over here who were like, you have to go to New York. And then I had the people over here who was like, you most certainly are going to go to Paris. And when I would ask why, the whole collective response was always because this is the city of art. And one of the most exciting moments of my youth was to correspond with, meet and play for JeanPierre Rampal. How many of you have heard him ever play any of his recordings? I encourage you to seek them out. JeanPierre Rampal is the greatest flutist of the 20th century and one of the greatest musical artists to ever have lived. And long story short, he was totally puzzled that I would consider taking early admission from a place called Stanford to go study in a world unrenowned town called Palo Alto. He thought that was a really bad idea. And so he tried very hard to convince me to move to Paris. You know, and I put this up here because I think sometimes the best advice is the advice that you don't take. When a trusted mentor pushes you very hard in a certain direction, it makes you reflect on things. And I was thinking that, you know, Silicon Valley is really like New York was, and before it, Paris. I believe it is the center of creative energy and creative minds coming from all over the world. In short, the place to be for an artist. So I went to Stanford, I stayed in Silicon Valley. I feel like I made the right decision because I have had close proximity to technologists, scientists, research, entrepreneurs, and kind of the ground zero of all of this technology activity. So I can bring these things into my art. So the next piece I'm going to talk about is called the Tree of Pascal. And this is where I have taken the technology of a pioneering EEG company and used it to extend it to create an artistic message. And so I've been for years, for like 20 years, I've been inspired by this statement from Blaise Pascal, who is a giant of interdisciplinary thinking. He was a mathematician, he was a philosopher, he was a creator, he was a writer. And he had this incredibly profound statement. He said, man is but a reed. He's the most feeble thing in nature, but he's a thinking reed. The entire universe need not arm itself to crush him. Just with a vapor or a drop of water, it could kill him. But if the universe were to crush him, man would still be more noble than that which killed him, because he knows that he dies, and the advantage which the universe has over him, the universe knows nothing of this. So all our dignity consists then in thought. So I wondered, what is the thinking reed for the 21st century? And my response was this installation. So in a nutshell, you can think about the Tree of Pascal as the brainwaves of over 100 people from all over the world working in concert to keep one small tree alive. And that's not metaphorical, that's real and literal. So over the course of the year, we collected the brainwaves of over 100 people, aggregated those, arranged them with custom software, have them running into the system such that you see this electrochromic glass on the front of that installation, and inside there's a little tree, a real little tree. And electrochromic glass is a material that has fascinated me for a long time because depending on the voltage that you apply to it, it either becomes opaque, like San Francisco fog, or it shifts and it becomes transparent. So the bottom line is that I calibrated this so that when all of the brain waves were at their highest level, so when everyone was thinking hard, the glass would the glass would go transparent, light could go through, photosynthesis could happen, and the tree could thrive. So the next piece of wisdom comes from some of my walking around Sand Hill Road. So I used to live close to this apartment complex on Sand Hill Road. You know, it's the road where all the venture capital offices are. And this apartment complex had these maintenance workers. There were like 12 of them, and I became friends with them all. They were all really cool guys. But one of them was really special because he had his maintenance uniform on. They had these incredible black braids. And he had this silver jewelry and this turquoise jewelry, and he had a bear claw around his neck. No one else had that. So of course I have to talk to this guy. His name was Running Elk. And I said, what is the bear claw story? What is this? He said, when I was 8 years old, I was nearly killed by a grizzly bear. My tribe, my family, they had to kill the bear to save my life. But they made a necklace out of the claw. They took that and they told me to wear it. And they said, we want you always to be thankful for your life to the bear and to always remember the awesome power of nature. And so we would talk a lot, and he knew that I was an artist. And so one day he took me to his secret place behind Sand Hill Road. He had this circle of stones, and at the equinox, he did a special ceremony he let me witness where he prayed to all four corners of the universe. He burnt sage, prayed to the ancestors, and we talked and talked and talked, and he made this gesture, and he motioned out over Sand Hill Road, and he said, you know, there's grass underneath that cement. There's earth underneath that cement. And it hit me. He's right. That underneath these dead cities that we built, the earth is underneath. And it's alive. And it's breathing. And it's far more powerful than anything that humanity has ever built, than any nuclear bomb that we have created, because we're the children of this earth. And the earth can crush us with one light shake, just as it did tragically in the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. And Silicon Valley is right on the San Andreas Fault, and it's said that an earthquake is inevitable. So, you know, although much of my work is devoted to technology, I'm also very interested in the epic glory and beauty and power of nature. So there's earth underneath the cement from Running Elk. And so the next artwork I want to show you is called After the Celestial Acts. This is me working on it. This is one view of it. So there was this magnificent tree. It is a huge oak tree. It would fit basically in this room on its side. It had fallen in a storm. It had been weakened at its base, and it unexpectedly fell over. I saw the tree, had this beautiful moss, the body of a dancer, and I all of a sudden had a vision, kind of a mythic idea. What about if we were to have a mythical axe fall from the heavens? I'm going to go to the video. Can you play the video? Oh, it's playing? Okay. Fall and slice the tree and recede back into the clouds and leave this frothy residue of reflective fragments. And so that's what you see here. It's just really an oak tree and mirrors. And you get this really interesting blend of earth and sky and trees, and the fragments are interesting to me because they're like these little poetic windows into the environment. But it's like a living artwork because it's always changing depending on the season, depending on the time of day. And depending on who's there. When you're standing in front of it, which you can't see what that would be like here, but when you're actually there, you see your whole body deconstructed. So it's also kind of form of living cubism. So my next piece of wisdom, the next gift I found, if you will, comes from Mika Hakkinen. Mika Hakkinen is one of the greatest Formula One drivers ever to have lived. He was nicknamed the Flying Finn. He's a really intense guy, really a character, and someone that had the really great experience of meeting on top of a mountain in Switzerland. And I was asking him, what is it like to drive the McLaren? So he was saying, you know, gesticulating and really got into it and with this full body and started telling me, when you're in Formula One and you're going around these curves, your body can be pulling up to 5 Gs. You can't open your mouth, your tongue will pop out. You have to develop special eye muscles because your eyes want to close under the pressure. It's so intense. Your fingers want to pop off the wheel because they're now 5 times heavier than they would be. Same things with your arms. Your arms are going to fly off. It's just at that point that you need to steer with calmness and steer with slowness and with control. You have to be slow while you're inside the speed, and that's the paradox of speed. And I thought that was incredible because that can apply to so many things, whether you're an entrepreneur in a startup or you're in a political campaign or you're an ER doctor, that while there's millions of things flying around in our face, that is just the point where we have to slow down inside all of that speed and move with just a little bit more poise. So speaking about speed, I've been obsessed with speed. And even when I was younger, I used to like to paint athletes in motion. And also speed is kind of one of the holy commandments of Silicon Valley. And the fastest artwork that I ever did was this one. So I had the fortune and the destiny of creating artwork that went very, very far and very, very fast, 25,000 miles per hour to be exact, which is, according to NASA, what's required for something to escape Earth's gravity and go into orbit. And so this is a piece that I did for the first zero gravity art exhibit at the International Space Station. And what I did was I created one painting. The painting was actually resembling a brush stroke and a brush and the brush stroke trailing from the brush, and a rocket and the exhaust trailing from the rocket. But then I took part of the painting, cut it out, and that part went into space. So there was a celestial piece that went up to the International Space Station, and there was a terrestrial earthbound piece that remained on Earth. The celestial piece went on its journey, it came back. We've framed it, and one is floating over the other. They're in the same frame. It's in a private collection in New York. But it's one painting, 2 different pieces. They're 2 different ages. It's the first time that has been done. And really, at the end of the day, it is a conceptual portrait of father and son astronauts, because there is a whole story behind that. And this is the 2 pieces reunited. So this is the last gift I found that I want to share with you. And it's a very personal one, and it's just this phrase, means life and death, and it's from my father. So it really speaks to me about our responsibility as humans and as creators. So after September 11th, several years after September 11th, my dad calls me on the phone from Tokyo, and he says, "Drue, I'm going to bring you the family samurai swords." And so I said, okay. And true to his word, several days later, he arrives at San Francisco International Airport, and he's there, and I'm like, well, what's happening with the sword? Did you ship that? Or he's like, no, I brought the sword in my carry-on luggage. And it was like you brought the sword in your carry-on baggage? Like, they didn't do anything like, stop you or anything like that? No. And so that's the story of how, instead of my dad going to jail, which is the good thing, I ended up being the first woman in my family to inherit the centuries-old Kataoka family samurai sword. But it wasn't like 5 months later, he called me on the phone, and he said he wasn't feeling well. He had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. And there was something in his voice that was like, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to beat this. Because he had this kind of indestructible attitude, Even as a child, they survived the fire bombings of Tokyo. And all throughout his life, he had this kind of invincible quality, an air about him. But, cancer is a merciless disease. And he was admitted into a hospital, and I would fly a lot to see him. I'd go back and forth between California and Japan, and I would go see him. And I was so disturbed because my formerly athletic father had shrunk to like a third of his body weight. But his big head was still there, and his big brain was still there. And he was so lucid, and all of his thoughts were so powerful. And that was unsettling too, in a way, that all of his ideas and thoughts were right there when they were just about to disappear. This cancer had spread to his vocal cords. They had to remove his vocal cords. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move his arms, but he could move his fingers. So he could communicate these incredible thoughts on paper. And so he could write. So I was thinking, what could I do in the last few days of my father's life? What could I give to him? So I know that he was a great jazz lover and actually connoisseur, really, of jazz. So I decided, it's like afternoon in Japan. I think it might be like 2 or 3 a.m. in New York. I'm going to call my friend and mentor, Wynton Marsalis, and just see if he'll pick up the phone and maybe he'll play. So luckily, he picked up the phone, and even more graciously, Wynton played on the phone. I held the phone to my father's ear. And this is like the last live music that my dad is ever going to hear in his life. And it was the most extraordinary concert that I've ever been to. And Wynton played St. James Infirmary, and then he ended with this Negro spiritual down by the riverside. And my dad was so moved by the music. It was very sad to see that he wanted to hum, he wanted to speak, and he realized that he couldn't. So he tapped on the side of the bed, and he tapped with the rhythms and polyrhythms of Wynton's music. There they are, separated by thousands of miles, but perfectly in sync. And so I give him the paper, and he writes this incredible note. And this is a picture of him, my dad, when he was well on the left, and then this is like, the last days of his life on the right. But he wrote this note, that this means life and death to me. I appreciate. And this is the actual note. And I was so struck by this because I was thinking, life and death, I think this is like the highest compliment that you can give anyone, especially it's coming from someone who's literally on the journey between life and death. And when you're dying, I imagine that you take kind of a 30,000-foot view of things, and the small things seem really insignificant, and you're kind of between these two poles of life and death. So to say something means life and death is to almost reach into the divine, into the immortal, into timelessness. And it just made me wonder, are we building or creating things that mean life or death to people, or just even to one person this year, in 5 years, in 100 years? So I went back and I created this piece, Airport for Souls, because after spending all that time, I started to see this haunting similarity between airports and hospitals. It's like, in the airport, passengers arrive and they depart, and they come and they go. In the hospital, people are born and they die every day. But is it arrivals, births, departures, deaths, or arrivals, deaths, departures, birth? And so I started to think about all these things, and I also started to think about my father's room, and I decided I was going to create an installation of his room. I was thinking about the electric hospital bed, the IVs, the little desk, also is austere, also intensely filled with emotion. But then I also painted a red circle in the center of the bed, kind of reflecting on my bicultural and biracial identity as an artist, and also as a tribute to him, because in a way making the whole canvas like the rising sun. But then something also more universal and human than that, which is that all of us enter the world this way as a spot of red blood on white hospital sheets. And many of us will leave the world that way as well. So the bed is his bed, but it's anybody's bed. The whole installation is about pain and suffering, but it's also about hope and rebirth. And so the last thing I'm going to leave you with is just about a 1-minute video that I would ask that you just listen to carefully. And it has the sound, so you can hear what it would kind of be like to be inside the installation. And you'll be in this room, you'll hear these recordings that I have blended from actual TSA recordings and airport recordings, which, again, within this metaphor, start to take on a really interesting meaning about the journey between life and death, and also high winds, because that year there were a lot of high winds, and I went up to high places and I recorded the winds and I blended them in.
Welcome to the Norman Wyman at San Jose International Airport. You are about to pass through a security screening checkpoint. Here's what you need to do to prepare yourself to make this process as quick and efficient as possible for you. Only ticketed passengers are permitted through the security checkpoint. You must present a valid government-issued photo identification and an airline boarding or gate pass for today's day to the TSA at the document checking station. We encourage each adult traveler to keep his or her airline boarding pass and government-issued photo ID in your hand and available for inspection until exiting the security checkpoint. Children are not required to show identification. When approaching the TSA document checking station, please ensure your photo ID is physically removed from any plastic sleeve or roll you normally carry. This will expedite the inspection of your identification and expedite your trip to the security checkpoint. The absence of proper identification will result in additional screening.
And so I'll just end with this quote from Shunryu Suzuki from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, bringing it full circle back to Steve Jobs and Dent, because this was one of Steve Jobs' favorite books that he read and reread. And he said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the mind of the expert, there are few. And this is a picture of me with my dad when I was little. So just a reminder to always keep our Zen mind, our beginner's mind, and just look at the world with awe. I am on the Twitter and Instagram, and I'm happy to answer any of the questions that you have. I've been interacting with a lot of you digitally this week, and just want to remind you that there are 2 artworks that are in the Continental Room that if you want to see, you can experience. So thank you all for coming and taking time from your busy lives to be here at Dent. And it's great to see you.
Thank you. That was fantastic.